Welcome to Narrative Nights. Step into a world of mystery, intrigue, and suspense. At Narrative Nights, we bring you thrilling detective stories that will challenge your mind and keep you guessing until the very end. Before we begin, we'd love to know, where in the world are you tuning in from? Drop a comment and let us know which part of the globe you're watching from. We're all united by the love of a good mystery. Let the investigation begin.
A Cry for Justice at Morningside. Chapter 1. A Letter in the Post. It was a peaceful spring morning in St. Mary Mead, and Miss Jane Marple was enjoying a tranquil moment in her cottage. The sunlight filtered gently through the lace curtains, casting soft shadows and illuminating the motes of dust that drifted lazily in the air. A gentle breeze fluttered the curtains, carrying the fresh scent of blooming flowers from the garden. The morning was serene, an ideal start to a day that promised nothing more than a few hours of quiet reflection. Miss Marple had just finished polishing her prized porcelain teapot, a family heirloom passed down from her grandmother. She was about to settle down in her favorite armchair by the window with a new detective novel when there came a gentle knock at the door. She rose slowly, her movements deliberate, and opened the door to find young Tommy, the local postman, standing with a small bundle of letters in his hand. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, tipping his cap. "Some letters for you, miss." She smiled warmly at the boy, accepting the stack of letters with a nod. As he rode off on his bicycle, Miss Marple returned to her living room, placing the letters on a polished side table. There were the usual assortment of invitations, parish notices, and advertisements. But one envelope caught her eye. It was soft blue, and the address was written in a trembling hand. Miss Marple's curiosity was piqued. She prided herself on noticing the smallest of details that others might dismiss as insignificant. Pouring herself a cup of tea, she sat down to read the letter. Inside, the paper was filled almost to the edges with frantic, looping handwriting. The words jumped out at her immediately: "My sister is innocent, please help us. She has been accused of murder, and she could never have done such a terrible thing." As she read, the writer explained that her sister worked as a maid in a large house. Her employer, a man named Lawrence DNE, had recently been found dead, and the maid, Margaret, had been discovered holding a bloody knife. Despite her protests of innocence, the authorities were convinced she was guilty. Miss Marple's sharp eyes lingered on the letter for a moment. She could sense the fear and desperation in the writer's words, and it stirred something deep within her. She had dealt with all manner of suspicions in her quiet village life, but rarely had she received such an urgent plea for help from a complete stranger. The letter was signed Ellen Preston, and included an address in a neighboring village. It was clear that Mrs. Preston, in her distress, had turned to Miss Marple for assistance, knowing of her reputation for solving difficult mysteries. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and placed it back into its envelope. She had no intention of dismissing this request. There was something about the writer's tone, both fearful and hopeful, that resonated with her. She often said that innocence and guilt were discovered in the subtle details of a person's life. People who claimed to be beyond suspicion, she knew, could be quite dangerous. Meanwhile, the truly innocent often appeared too frightened or too confused to defend themselves properly. She wondered if this was one such case. Rising with purpose, Miss Marple tidied her knitting basket, set her teacup down on its saucer, and drafted a quick note to the local vicar, explaining that she would not be attending the gardening fundraiser next week. After all, she had a new investigation to begin. Miss Marple donned her cardigan, took up her handbag, and stepped out into the morning air, determined to meet Mrs. Preston in person and uncover the truth behind this troubling case. Chapter 2. A Tense Confession. Miss Marple rose early the following day and set off for the neighboring village. The journey involved 2 bus changes and a pleasant walk along a winding country lane. The weather was fair, with the sun peeping through gentle clouds, and the air was crisp and refreshing. It was the kind of day that lifted the spirits, despite the somber purpose of her trip. Upon reaching the outskirts of the village, Miss Marple consulted the directions Mrs. Preston had provided. The cottage was located at the end of a narrow lane, just beyond a small duck pond. Sure enough, after a short walk, she found herself standing in front of a modest whitewashed house with a thatched roof. The garden was neat, though not particularly remarkable, save for a row of bright geraniums near the front door. She knocked gently, and after a few moments, the door opened to reveal a thin, anxious-looking woman. This, Miss Marple surmised, was Ellen Preston. "Miss Marple, I presume?" Mrs. Preston asked, her voice trembling with barely contained anxiety. "Yes, indeed," Miss Marple replied kindly, smiling at the woman. "I hope I'm not too early. I wanted to make sure we had plenty of time to talk." Mrs. Preston ushered her inside, leading her to a small sitting room, its furnishings simple but warm. A fire crackled in the hearth, and 2 mismatched cups and a teapot sat on a low table. Mrs. Preston appeared to have been expecting her, though her nervousness betrayed her composure. "I can't thank you enough for coming," Mrs. Preston said, her voice faltering as she poured the tea. "I had nowhere else to turn. The police won't listen to me, and my poor sister is locked away in that dreadful cell, so frightened." Miss Marple gave her a reassuring smile. "I'm pleased to help, if I can. Please, do tell me everything you know. Begin at the beginning. Don't leave out any details, as the smallest things often turn out to be the most important." Mrs. Preston nodded, taking a moment to compose herself before beginning her tale. Her sister, Margaret, Meg, as the family called her, had worked as a maid at Morningside House for nearly 6 months. Meg had been desperate for work after their mother's death had left them in a precarious financial situation. Mrs. Preston, a widow with only a small pension, depended on Meg's wages to make ends meet. Meg had written often, and her last letter, sent just a week before the tragedy, hinted at troubles with her employer, Mr. Lawrence DNE. She mentioned that Mr. DNE had threatened to dismiss her, though Mrs. Preston was unsure why. Miss Marple listened intently, her sharp mind processing every word. She could tell that Mrs. Preston was deeply concerned for her sister, but she also noticed the subtle signs of strain in the woman's face. "Did Meg seem particularly worried about this threat?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Preston wiped a tear from her cheek. "Yes, she was terribly worried. She tried to please Mr. DNE, making his tea just the way he liked it, keeping his room perfect, but it was never enough. She thought perhaps he was troubled by something else, something private. I don't know what it was, but I know it was eating away at him." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "I see. And then, on the day of his death, what happened?" Mrs. Preston's eyes filled with fresh tears. "Meg was the one who discovered him. She went to bring him a fresh pot of tea, and the others heard her scream. When they rushed in, there she was, holding the knife, and Mr. DNE was already dead." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "And what did Meg say?" "She said she had only picked up the knife, perhaps to pull it away from him, or because she was in shock. But no one believed her. The police just assumed she had done it." Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Mrs. Preston. "Did you hear of any other quarrels or tensions in the household before Mr. Dunt's death? Any other people who might have had a motive?" Mrs. Preston frowned. "Only that he argued with his wife, but who knows the details? Meg mentioned that Mrs. DNE sometimes took out her frustrations on the servants, though she wasn't unkind, just distant. Miss Marple nodded again, her mind working rapidly. "Thank you, Mrs. Preston. You've given me much to think about. I will visit Morningside House myself. It's often best to see the place in person, to speak with the people involved, and observe their behavior. People often reveal more than they intend, especially when one listens carefully." Mrs. Preston gave a shaky smile, her relief palpable. "Thank you, Miss Marple. Thank you so much." Chapter 3. Welcome to Morningside House. The following morning, Miss Marple set off for Morningside House, her curiosity piqued by the subtle clues that had begun to emerge. It was a crisp, clear day, the sort of day that made the world seem just a little bit brighter despite the dark mystery that awaited her. The village she passed through was quiet, with only a few villagers out and about. The peacefulness of the setting did little to diminish the gravity of her task. As she approached Morningside House, the estate loomed in the distance, a grand Greyston manor covered in ivy, standing amidst acres of manicured gardens. The building seemed to possess a quiet dignity, as if it had been standing watch over its inhabitants for generations. Yet there was something about it that Miss Marple couldn't quite place, something that suggested all was not as it seemed within the walls of this imposing house. She was greeted at the door by a housemaid, dressed in neat black attire. The maid looked flustered, as if she had been expecting Miss Marple's visit, but unsure of how to conduct herself. Without asking too many questions, she led Miss Marple through the hallways, the silence of the house hanging thick in the air. Miss Marple's eyes took in the grandeur of the house, the high ceilings, the polished wood floors, and the portraits of ancestors gazing down with a distant, cold air. It was the sort of house that had once been alive with laughter and chatter but now seemed to possess a heavy stillness, as though the sorrow within its walls had weighed it down for years. The maid led Miss Marple to the drawing-room, where Miss Marple found Mrs. Camilla DNE waiting for her. Mrs. DNE was a woman in her late 40s, with dark, tired eyes that seemed to look through Miss Marple rather than at her. Her once delicate features were now hardened by grief and perhaps a little guilt. She was dressed in black, the traditional mourning attire of the day, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Good afternoon," Mrs. DNE greeted Miss Marple, her voice stiff. "I understand you've come to investigate my husband's death." Miss Marple inclined her head politely. "I have, indeed, Mrs. DNE. I'm here to offer any assistance I can in clarifying the events surrounding your husband's untimely passing." Mrs. Dunt's lips tightened at the mention of her late husband. She gestured toward a seat, her face unreadable. "If you must ask questions, then ask. Though I don't see what good it will do." Miss Marple seated herself gracefully, her hands folded in her lap. "I would be most grateful if you could walk me through the facts of what happened. Sometimes, hearing the details directly can offer new perspectives." Mrs. DNE hesitated for a moment before speaking. Lawrence had been troubled for some time, she said, her voice betraying the strain she was under. His business affairs were in disarray. I know he grew increasingly short-tempered with everyone, especially with the maid, Margaret. She paused, her eyes clouding with emotion. He even threatened to dismiss her just the day before he died. Miss Marple's gaze was steady as she listened. "And what happened that day?" Mrs. DNE sighed deeply, her face pale. "I was in the morning room, attending to some accounts, when I heard a scream. By the time I reached his study, it was too late. There was Meg, standing over him with the knife in her hand. I couldn't believe it. I summoned the rest of the household, but by then, Lawrence was already gone." Miss Marple's expression softened with sympathy. "That must have been a dreadful shock for you." Mrs. DNE nodded but said nothing more. Miss Marple waited patiently for her to continue. After a long pause, Mrs. DNE spoke again, this time with a slight tremor in her voice. The police questioned Meg, she said, but it seemed clear to them that she had done it. She had no alibi, and they found her holding the knife. There was nothing else to say. It was over. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. And was there any quarrel between your husband and anyone else in the household? Perhaps someone else who may have had a reason to harm him. Mrs. Dunt's eyes flickered with discomfort as she considered the question. Oh, he quarreled with everyone, she said, her voice tinged with bitterness. He was impossible to please. He had arguments with Celia, my daughter, just the day before. He was also asking his mother for money, but she refused to help him again. It was all about money, he never had enough, and it drove him mad. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Did you notice anything unusual in the days leading up to his death? Any signs that Mr. DNE might have been under more stress than usual? Mrs. Dunt's gaze drifted out the window, as if searching for an answer in the garden beyond. He was always angry, she murmured. But that morning, when he died, he seemed different, almost desperate. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now, in hindsight, I see how much he was suffering. Miss Marple made a note in her little notebook, then smiled gently at Mrs. DNE. Thank you for sharing that with me. It must have been difficult to speak of, but I believe it will be helpful in the investigation. Mrs. Dunt's face softened, though her sorrow was still evident. I don't know what more to say. We all lost so much that day. Miss Marple stood and made her way to the door. If you don't mind, I would like to speak to your daughter, Celia. She may have some insight into her father's state of mind before his death. Mrs. DNE nodded, her expression distant. Of course. I'll see if I can get her to speak with you. She's been very quiet since the tragedy. Chapter 4: Our Mother's Defense. Miss Marple followed Mrs. DNE down the corridor to a small sitting room where Celia, the daughter, sat by the window. The girl appeared young, fragile, and far too innocent for the weight of tragedy that had befallen her family. Her eyes were rimmed with red, as if she had been crying, and there was a sense of quiet sorrow that hung around her like a veil. May I sit with you for a moment, my dear? Miss Marple asked gently, stepping into the room. Celia nodded, her lips trembling slightly. Mother said you wanted to ask me some questions, she said in a soft voice. Miss Marple took a seat opposite her, watching her carefully. I do, if you're willing to share. I know this is a difficult time, but sometimes, talking about things helps to bring clarity. Celia folded her hands in her lap, her gaze fixed on the floor. I know you're trying to find the truth, she said quietly. But it's all so confusing. I keep thinking I'll wake up, and it'll all be a bad dream. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. It must be a dreadful shock for you. I understand that you and your father had a quarrel just before his death. Celia's face tightened, and her voice faltered. Yes, she admitted. I told him I was in love with someone, a young man from the village. He didn't understand. He forbade me to see him, said I was too young to make such decisions. That's when I told him I was pregnant. Miss Marple watched her closely, sensing the deep pain in the girl's words. That must have been a very emotional conversation for both of you. Celia nodded, her face flushed with embarrassment. He got so angry. He told me I was being foolish, that I had responsibilities at home. I was so upset. I said things I didn't mean. I stormed off to my room. Miss Marple's expression remained calm. And the next time you saw your father, he he was already dead. Celia nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I didn't mean for it to happen like that. I never wanted this. Miss Marple gave her hand a reassuring pat. I'm sure it was a terrible shock. But can you remember anything unusual after you left the study? Perhaps you heard anything, any voices raised, or maybe a sudden cry. Celia hesitated, then shook her head. I heard the front door slam later. I think it was Aunt Beatrice leaving. After that, I heard footsteps running up the stairs. I think it was Mother. That's when she screamed. Miss Marple gave her a small, thoughtful nod. Thank you, my dear. I know this must be difficult, but every little detail can help us understand what really happened. As Miss Marple left the room, she felt a new wave of clarity beginning to take shape in her mind. Celia's admission of her pregnancy and the heated argument with her father had added another layer to the puzzle. Yet, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something missing, one final detail that would illuminate the truth. With her notebook in hand, Miss Marple resolved to visit the study next and take a closer look at the evidence. The house seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the truth to emerge. And Miss Marple, with her keen sense of observation, was determined to find it. Chapter 5: A Hint of Scandal. Miss Marple's determination grew stronger as she made her way through Morningside House, each step echoing softly in the quiet, expansive hallways. The house seemed to press in on her, with its cold grandeur and the unspoken weight of secrets hidden behind every corner. She had spent the last several hours gathering clues, speaking to the family members, and observing the delicate web of relationships that had tied them all together. But now, as she approached the study, Lawrence DNE's study, she knew that the final answers might lie within the room that had once been his sanctuary. The study was located at the end of a long corridor, where the silence seemed almost oppressive. The door to the room stood ajar, and Miss Marple stepped inside, carefully closing it behind her. The air was thick with the scent of old leather and dust, and the room was bathed in a soft, amber light that filtered through the curtains. A large mahogany desk dominated the space, cluttered with papers, books, and business correspondence. The bookshelves lined the walls, heavy with the weight of unread volumes, their spines gathering dust. Miss Marple's sharp eyes scanned the room methodically. The study, though impressive, had an air of disorder about it, papers strewn carelessly across the desk, books pulled from their shelves, and a general sense of neglect. She ran her fingers over the surface of the desk, noting the way certain papers had been hastily shoved aside, as if someone had been searching for something in a hurry. She turned her attention to the drawers. Most of them were unlocked, containing nothing more than the usual detritus, pens, paperclips, and half-finished invoices. But the bottom drawer was locked. Miss Marple's curiosity was piqued, and she felt an instinctive pull to open it. She knew that whatever lay behind that locked drawer could hold the key to understanding what had truly happened to Lawrence DNE. Carefully, she examined the desk for any signs of where the key might be hidden. After a few minutes of searching, her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic tucked between the pages of a well-worn atlas. It was the key. With a steady hand, she inserted it into the lock, and the drawer opened with a soft click. Inside, she found a small ledger, its cover worn and scuffed from years of use. Miss Marple handled it with care, flipping through its pages. The entries were mostly business-related, lists of debts, overdue invoices, and the occasional business triumph. But as she neared the final pages, the tone of the entries shifted. The earlier notes had been orderly and professional, but these last few entries were frantic, filled with desperate scribbles and dark thoughts. One particular entry caught her eye. It was a disjointed passage, written in a hurried hand, "Can't see a way out. If only they understood how hopeless it all is." The pressure is unbearable. Everyone wants something from me. How can I keep this up? How much longer can I pretend? The word sent a chill down Miss Marple's spine. Lawrence DNE had been under immense pressure, both financial and emotional, and it was clear from these entries that he had been spiraling into despair. His relationships with his wife, daughter, and mother had been fraught with tension, and he seemed to feel trapped in a life that he could no longer control. Miss Marple paused, her mind racing. Was this simply the result of a man overwhelmed by his circumstances, or was there more to it? She had been hesitant to consider the possibility of suicide, but the evidence before her was compelling. Lawrence Dunt's despair seemed genuine, and the idea of him taking his own life no longer felt so far-fetched. As she closed the ledger and replaced it in the drawer, Miss Marple heard the soft sound of footsteps in the hallway. She turned to see Mrs. Camilla DNE standing in the doorway, her eyes fixed on the open drawer and the papers scattered across the desk. "You're quite thorough, Miss Marple," Mrs. DNE remarked, her voice cool but with an edge of unease. "Perhaps more thorough than the police themselves." Miss Marple gave a polite, non-committal smile. "I simply wish to understand what happened, Mrs. DNE. I believe the truth can often be found in the smallest of details." Mrs. DNE stepped further into the room, her gaze lingering on the ledger. "What have you found, Miss Marple? Have you uncovered something that could exonerate Margaret?" Miss Marple's eyes met hers, and for a moment there was a flicker of something, perhaps guilt or fear, in Mrs. Dunt's expression. "I have found indications that your husband was a very troubled man, dear lady. It may help explain some of the events leading up to his death." Mrs. Dunt's face tightened, her features betraying little emotion. "I see," she said stiffly. "Well, if you found something of interest, I trust you'll be taking it with you." Miss Marple nodded gently. "I intend to speak with the constable about the findings here. But it's my hope that the truth will be helpful to everyone involved, not just to clear Margaret's name but to shed light on the larger picture." Mrs. DNE gave a tight, humorless smile. "I'm sure it will, Miss Marple. I just hope that all this investigation won't stir up more trouble than it's worth." Miss Marple stepped past her and left the study, her mind already working through the implications of what she had just discovered. She had seen a glimpse into Lawrence Dunt's tortured soul, his despair, his financial troubles, and the constant pressure from his family. The picture was becoming clearer, but there were still pieces of the puzzle missing. Chapter 6: Secrets of a Daughter. The next morning, Miss Marple felt the weight of the case bearing down on her as she made her way to the second floor of Morningside House. She was determined to speak with Celia, the daughter, one last time. There was something about the girl's behavior, the nervousness in her eyes, the way she had spoken of her father, that lingered in Miss Marple's mind. When she arrived at Celia's room, the door was slightly ajar. She knocked softly before entering. The room was small and simple, with a faint smell of lavender in the air. Celia sat by the window, gazing out at the garden. The girl looked younger than her years, her face pale and drawn from grief. Her eyes reddened with recent tears, and she looked up as Miss Marple entered. "May I sit with you, my dear?" Miss Marple asked gently, her voice soft. Celia nodded, and Miss Marple took a seat across from her. There was a long pause as the two women sat in silence. Finally, Celia spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mother told me you wanted to ask me questions," she said. "But I don't know what to say. I don't know what happened to Father. I don't even know what I'm supposed to believe anymore." Miss Marple studied her for a moment, then spoke softly. "It must be a dreadful shock, losing a father in such a violent manner. But I believe you may hold the key to understanding what really happened. Celia's eyes widened slightly, and she blinked back tears. "What do you mean?" "I don't know anything about it." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady. "Your father, from what I've gathered, was under a great deal of pressure. Financial troubles, conflicts with the family, and a sense of despair that seemed to have overwhelmed him. Did you notice any signs of this? Any indication that he might have felt trapped?" Celia hesitated, then nodded slowly. "He was always so angry. Always angry at something or someone. And when I told him about the baby, he didn't take it well." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "You told him you were pregnant?" Celia's voice trembled. "Yes. He didn't understand. He said I was too young to make such decisions. He was so angry, Miss Marple. We argued. I told him I was in love with someone, and I was serious about him. And he said I wasn't serious, that I was just being foolish." Miss Marple nodded. "And after the argument, did you hear anything unusual? A raised voice, a cry?" Celia thought for a moment, then nodded. "I heard Aunt Beatrice leaving the house, and I heard the footsteps, too. But I didn't think much of it." Miss Marple gave her hand a reassuring pat. "Thank you, my dear. You've been very helpful. Sometimes, it's the smallest details that help us find the truth." As Miss Marple left the room, she felt the weight of the case lift slightly. Celia's confession about the pregnancy, the argument with her father, and the tension in the house all added another layer to the mystery. But the question remained, was it murder, or was it something far more tragic? Miss Marple knew that she would have to keep searching until the final truth was uncovered, no matter how long it took. The pieces were beginning to fit together, but the full picture was still elusive. She could feel the truth just beyond her grasp, and she was determined to uncover it, no matter what it took. Chapter 7: A Note in the Dark. The following day, Miss Marple felt a quiet determination settle within her as she made her way down the long, dimly lit corridor of Morningside House. The house, still heavy with sorrow and secrets, seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. She had spoken with most of the family members by now, each one had provided their version of events, and each had revealed something important, yet the truth still eluded her. As she passed by a portrait of Lawrence DNE in his younger years, looking down upon her with his customary air of authority, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the mystery pressing down on her. His death had created a ripple through this household, but was it truly murder, or something far more tragic? She was lost in her thoughts when she heard a soft shuffle of footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw Lucy, the housemaid who had first admitted her into Morningside House. The young woman was standing at the far end of the hallway, her apron twisted nervously in her hands, her eyes darting about as though she were trying to decide whether to approach Miss Marple or retreat. "Miss Marple," Lucy said hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. I wondered if you had a moment." Miss Marple smiled warmly, sensing the girl's unease. "Of course, my dear. Let's speak somewhere quiet." She led Lucy toward a small alcove near the back staircase, out of earshot from the main rooms of the house. Lucy glanced around nervously, then sat down on the low bench beside Miss Marple. She wrung her hands in her lap, her eyes focused on the floor. After a long silence, she finally spoke. "My name's Lucy," she said in a voice that trembled with uncertainty. "I've been working here for a year now. I knew Meg. She's always been so kind, so gentle. I can't believe she did it. I can't believe she's being accused of murder." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap and regarded Lucy with a calm, reassuring gaze. If there's anything you know that could help, anything at all, please do tell me. Every detail matters." Lucy hesitated, glancing over her shoulder before she spoke again. "Well, I saw Mr. DNE the night before it happened. He looked more troubled than usual. He was pacing around the corridors, muttering to himself. I couldn't catch what he was saying, but it sounded like he was talking about letting people down. He seemed near tears, like he was on the verge of breaking down." Miss Marple's brow furrowed slightly, intrigued. "Did you notice anything else? Any other unusual behavior?" Lucy's hands twisted tighter in her lap as she nodded slowly. "Later, I went to tidy Aunt Beatrice's room. She wasn't in, and I noticed a letter on her dressing table. I wasn't snooping, but the page was open, and I saw Mr. Dunt's name. It looked like it was from a solicitor, something about a divorce, about dividing assets." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened at this. "A divorce?" Lucy nodded, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "I didn't mean to look at it. I put it right back where I found it. But then the next day, Mr. DNE was dead." The revelation hung in the air, heavy with implication. A letter about a divorce, a legal matter of great significance, could have been the catalyst for a family rift. The thought lingered in Miss Marple's mind. Could this have been the final straw for Lawrence DNE, the one thing that pushed him over the edge? Lucy looked at Miss Marple, her eyes wide with worry. "I didn't tell the police about it. It's not my place to meddle, but I wanted you to know. There were other things going on, things that might have driven Mr. DNE to despair. Or might have made someone angry enough to hurt him." Miss Marple gave her a gentle, reassuring smile. "You've done nothing wrong, Lucy. Your honesty is more helpful than you realize. Sometimes, the smallest details can make all the difference." Lucy let out a shaky sigh of relief. "I just want Meg to be free." "She didn't do it, Miss Marple. She couldn't." Miss Marple patted her arm comfortingly before standing up. "I will do my best to get to the truth, Lucy. You've been very brave to tell me all this." As Miss Marple left the alcove, her thoughts raced. The information Lucy had shared about the letter, the divorce proceedings, and Mr. Dunt's troubled state confirmed many of the suspicions Miss Marple had been harboring. The family dynamics were strained, to say the least, and it seemed as though every member had a reason to feel aggrieved or upset with Lawrence DNE. But now, there was something new to consider, a possible financial motive. A divorce could have meant the loss of status and wealth for Mrs. DNE, Beatrice, and even Celia. Was it possible that someone in the household had become desperate enough to act out of fear or anger? Miss Marple's steps grew more purposeful as she made her way outside for some fresh air. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garden, and she paused by a flower bed, inhaling the scent of the blooming tulips. The case had taken on new complexity, and the final pieces of the puzzle seemed tantalizingly close, though still out of reach. She had spent the past few days piecing together the fragments of truth, but she knew there was one final conversation she needed to have. One final interview to conduct before the full story could be revealed. As she stood there, lost in thought, she heard the crunch of gravel underfoot. Turning, she saw the local constable approaching, his hat in hand and his face set in a serious expression. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he said briskly. "I was told I might find you here." Miss Marple straightened up, her mind already shifting into detective mode. "Good afternoon, Constable. I was about to look for you myself. There's something we need to discuss regarding some papers I found in Mr. Dunt's study." The constable nodded, his expression grave. I've heard the family is concerned about the investigation. There's been a lot of tension here, and they don't want anything to be stirred up further." Miss Marple gave a small, knowing smile. "I understand, but I believe the truth must come out. The ledger I found suggests that Mr. DNE was not only financially burdened but emotionally distraught as well. There may be crucial details hidden in these papers." The constable glanced around, lowering his voice. "Do you think this points to someone else being responsible for his death, or perhaps it wasn't murder at all?" Miss Marple's eyes met his, steady and calm. "I haven't drawn any firm conclusions yet, Constable. But let's just say that I'm not entirely convinced Margaret Preston is guilty. I believe there's a missing piece of the puzzle, something that will make everything clear." The constable nodded, his expression softening. "I'll help however I can. If you think there's more to find, I'm willing to support you." Miss Marple thanked him, inwardly resolved to continue her search. The pieces were almost in place, but she knew there was one more conversation to have, one more piece of the puzzle to uncover. Until then, she would not rest. Chapter 8: The Final Reveal. By the time Miss Marple returned to Morningside House, the late afternoon sun was casting long, dramatic shadows across the estate. The house seemed to be holding its breath, awaiting the inevitable conclusion. Miss Marple had spent the last several days speaking with everyone, carefully collecting details, observations, and revelations. Now, it was time to bring the family together. In the grand entrance hall, Miss Marple stood at the base of the sweeping staircase, waiting for the family members to assemble. Mrs. Camilla DNE, Beatrice Morgan, Celia DNE, and Mrs. Euphemia DNE arrived one by one, their faces marked by grief and unease. The constable, who had arrived shortly before, stood nearby, his hands clasped behind his back. Miss Marple's calm voice broke the silence. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "I realize this is a painful time, but the matter of Mr. Lawrence Dunt's death remains unresolved. Margaret Preston, the maid, has been accused of his murder. However, I have uncovered some rather important facts that point to a different conclusion." A flicker of fear and curiosity passed across Mrs. Dunt's face. "If you've evidence that Margaret is guilty, then be done with it," she said, her voice betraying her anxiety. Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Far from it, Mrs. DNE. In fact, I believe she had nothing to do with your husband's death, aside from discovering him too late." The room fell silent as Miss Marple revealed what she had uncovered. She spoke of the financial pressures Lawrence DNE had been under, his strained relationships with his family, and the toll it had taken on him. She revealed the contents of the hidden ledger, where Lawrence had written of his despair and his desire to escape his problems. The room was still as Miss Marple finished, and Celia, her face pale, whispered, "So, it wasn't murder?" "No," Miss Marple replied softly. "I believe Mr. DNE took his own life. And poor Margaret, upon finding him, simply panicked. The knife she held was in his hand when she arrived, and she tried to remove it, but the scene was misinterpreted." A collective sigh of relief filled the room, though sorrow still lingered. Mrs. DNE buried her face in her hands, and Celia's tears flowed freely, both from the relief that her family was not guilty and from the sorrow of losing a father under such tragic circumstances. Miss Marple nodded gently. "The truth has a way of coming to light, my dear. Now, we can finally begin to heal." As the family members gathered around, Miss Marple quietly excused herself, her heart lightened by the knowledge that justice had been done. Margaret Preston was cleared of suspicion, and the truth had emerged at last. As she stepped out into the garden, the late afternoon sun warmed her face, and Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The case had been a difficult one, but the truth had prevailed. And in the end, that was all that mattered.